Welcome to the Unlocking the Club podcast, where we host honest and direct conversations about journeys of access, personal truth, and reclaiming space. We share our truth so that you can find the key to own your truth, honor your journey, and reclaim your space. Grab your keys, your wallet, your phone, and invite your friends to meet you at the club. Here's your host, Angela Taylor.
Hello again. I'm Angela Taylor, your host for Unlocking the Club, and it is wonderful to have you back in our space today. Unlocking the Club is literally a space where my guests and I discuss what we're up to in our lives, both personally and professionally, unpack a lot of the stories, our journey, and more importantly, have this really candid conversation about who we've had to be throughout our journeys, not just what we're doing along the journey, not just the outcome of those journeys, but who we've actually had to be along the way throughout that journey. And I think that the core of what we do on this podcast is to, unlock our truths in a way that is cathartic and impactful. So rarely do many of us feel compelled and maybe have the psychological safety to share our story, our full truth. And so my hope is that my guest today and you, our amazing listeners, and even myself, learn a little bit about ourselves through the stories that we share in conversation that we have today. And one of the things that's really on the top of my mind is this sense of, I talked to so many clients over the last few months, and there's this sense of, like, why am I here? What is my purpose? What am I destined to do? What gives me the joy that I seek on a regular basis? And one of the things that I think is really important for us to do in those moments is to listen to our inner voice. What makes us happy? What does bring us joy? What's easy for us to do? What's your superpower? What's your gift? What is it that you want to do, the impact that you want to have? And if you were heading in that direction, keep going. And if you're not, it's a perfect opportunity for you to pause, to reflect, and to figure out if you need to change direction. And today on Unlocking the Club, we're actually going to talk about that with our special guest. I'm really excited to unlock our journey, our destination with today's special guest, Mildred J. Mills. On today's episode of Unlocking the Club, I'm joined by Mildred J. Mills. Mildred grew up picking cotton on her father's 60-acre farm in Wetumpka, Alabama, a small town about 25 miles northeast of Montgomery. Mildred's first book, Daddy's House, a daughter's memoir of setbacks, triumphs, and growing new roots, is actually due mid-December 2023. Her essay, Daddy's House, A Place to Run Away From, won the 2022 Etruscan Prize and was published in the Etruscan Press. Amazing Grace, an essay, was recently published in the anthology, A Journey into Art. Mildred is also the host of My Cotton Patch Moment, a motivational podcast about never settling for less than one's best by working hard to accomplish your goals. Thanks for tuning in to Unlocking the Club as we join our special guest, Mildred J. Mills. Mildred, it is so wonderful to meet you. Thank you for joining us on Unlocking the Club.
Thank you, Angela, for having me. It is such an honor to be with you today.
I've had the pleasure of being in conversation, and you come highly recommended for this podcast through a mutual friend in Bethany Hawkins. And I am so grateful to Bethany for introducing me to you, but most certainly introducing me to your podcast, My Cotton Patch Moment. So many of the stories and the episodes that you've had resonated for many reasons. It literally is the basis of what we're trying to do here on Unlocking the Club. And so you have books that are published, you have essays, you have a podcast, you have a lot going on, a long IT career. And I wonder, beyond the bio, who is Mildred J. Mills?
Mildred J. Mills is this little girl who decided at a very young age that God didn't put her on earth to be a cotton picker. I saw so much more as that little girl, and I have this picture of myself at about 4 or 5 years old where I'm standing on this little porch looking across the wild blue yonder at the farm and all the cows and the pigs and all these things. And I knew that there was so much more beyond that, but I had no concept of how to get to that place. So Mildred J. Mills is this person who has dreamed all of her life of being a message to others, motivational person to others, someone who refused to accept that place where she was born as the end all and be all.
Hmm. Let's unpack that a little bit. Like this little 4 or 5 year old girl sitting on the porch looking out across the farm had this sense of there's more out there. Like, how did you get to that point? Can you recall what were the mechanisms? Were there conversations in your household? Was there a sense that there's something beyond the farm? How did you know at that early stage in your life that there was more for you?
I just knew because I just didn't feel I loved my family. I loved my father and my mother, and I knew that they loved me also. But there was just so many people. I was the third of 17 children born to my parents. And of course, I spent a lot of time alone. In fact, one of my sisters told me years later that I left home at age 18 and I left a bunch of little brothers and sisters who really didn't remember me being there. And so my mother would talk to them about me. And she said, she's a child of few words, but she has this heart as big as gold. And she said, you don't know what she's thinking, but she sure does accomplish a lot. But as this little girl, I guess I thought, I like this place, but I want to see other places. This is not, couldn't possibly be the only space there is in this world for me. And I remember at age 16, I won a trip to California through the home economics department. And I saw things that I had never seen before. I finally saw that world that I knew was out there, but I hadn't had an opportunity to find it. I saw people that didn't look like me. I saw brown people that were working in fields, but they weren't cotton fields. They were picking strawberries. I saw the Hollywood Bowl. I saw all these things that my little mind knew must have been there someplace, but I finally had an opportunity to see those things. So, why did I know at age 4 or 5 that there was more to this world? Because even though I could see far away, I know there was something beyond that far away that I wasn't seeing when I was looking out into the wild blue yonder.
Right? And my sense is that, right, you had to trust your intuition. You
I did.
didn't know, you hadn't seen it, you hadn't witnessed it. No one was in particular telling you about this, but you had this intuition, this sense, and you had to listen to yourself in those moments and trust in a really, I think, complex situations. Because so often in families or communities where we're a tribe, where here's our aspiration, we should seek to do what we do well here, what we are familiar with, or what everybody else is with, and be satisfied with that. But you still had this sense, this intuition that there was more.
Absolutely. Absolutely, I did. And I saw my mother would say to me, I want my girls to have so much more than I have. My mother told me her story years later, and she said she had wanted to be a beautician. She wanted to be a school teacher. She wanted to be many things, but she ended up being a farmer's wife with 17 babies. And she said, I just want my girls to have more than I have. And she was never one of those people my mother always had a smile on her face when she walked outside that door. And you could never tell that she might have been under stress or duress in the house with so much on her. So I took delight in that. And I just thought, if mom wants more, there must be more. She knows there is more. So I'm going to find out what that more is. And I'm going to go find it. I'm going to go get it.
Yes, go get it. And that is the story I think so often throughout time of Black mothers is that they do everything they can to prepare their children to thrive, not just survive, but to be able to thrive. And just the words of your mother, the wisdom that she established inside of you, and the permission she gave you to go and do and be and become is
Yeah,
really powerful.
absolutely. She also said, I just want you to have more. But she also said that do the best you can with what you have. It doesn't matter. She said, if you have one dress, get up in the morning, put that dress on, and at the end of the day, wash it, hang it up, and dry it, and put it back on the next day because we didn't have a lot. Imagine being on that farm, and my parents didn't come from wealth. They were the youngest of very large families. She was the youngest of 10. He was the youngest of 12. And They didn't come from any wealth, and they were the first people in their families to have high school educations. They didn't go to college. They were high school educated people, but they wanted more for their children. And I tell you what, if hard work was an education, I would have so many doctorates because they sure instill that work ethic in us. And I've always said, you may be smarter than me, but I promise you, you cannot outwork me because I was never going back to that farm once I left because that's hard work. It's almost like being imprisoned or something or other. And I'm not knocking the life that I had because it made me the woman that I am. But my parents just taught me that you work hard and you can achieve anything. And I know that to be a fact.
Yes, well, and you talk quite often. I enjoyed a few episodes ago. You had a podcast where you talked about your father and the role he played in your life, the impact that he's had on your journey. Can you share some of those lessons you learned from your father? Can you share the impact that he had on who you are today as you lean into that work ethic and that vision of who you can be?
Absolutely. My father, I was a very young girl, probably that 5, 6 years old, when he told me I saw him sawing on a piece of wood out in the yard, and I was standing there watching him. I said, "What you doing, Daddy?" He said, "I'm making you a bench." And he made this wooden thing, put it on a bucket in a car, and he said, "I'm going to make you my bookkeeper." And he sold products from the farm to especially ladies who were living alone. I don't know why they were alone, but they were alone. And so he gave me this pencil and a little tablet. And I wrote these people's names on it. And I wrote how much he charged for certain things. And if those ladies didn't pay, I said, that lady needs to pay you. She didn't pay you last time. And so years later in my father's life, he said, I couldn't believe that you were telling me that lady needs to pay you this time because she didn't pay last time. I didn't remember that, but he said, you were quite the bully on the money. He said you had a great financial head on you even back then. And so I think also that my father was very, I would call rough on us because he was quite the disciplinarian. In fact, today they would call it abuse. But I don't hold that against him today because I know that everything that I am today has so much to do with who he was or who he taught me to be back then. He said harsh things. And I thought, my God, how does someone who loves you say these things or beat you like he did? But like I said, I hold nothing against my father. I was there a few days before his death, and I was able to stand there, forgive my father for things that I thought should have been, that I thought were quite mean or whatever. And I knew my father would never say, I'm sorry, but that's okay. I said to myself, I forgive you. And I thank God for allowing me to be here with you in your moment of need.
Yeah. How do you reconcile those competing thoughts? Because as human beings who want to be loved, right? And love your parents unconditionally, but also recognize that there might have been some situations that weren't healthy, weren't optimal, but that was for so many generations what they knew.
Absolutely.
How do you reconcile those two competing thoughts?
The way I reconcile those is I also had a mother. That mother
Mhm.
was kind, she was gentle, and she was very nurturing, and she held no grudges, and she harbored no resentment. She was abused, but she never ever, she always said to us, if you dared say to her, why do you put up with that, mom? She said, that's your father. And she just left it at that. That's your father. So she never ever listened to us. She never allowed us to talk badly about my father. And she said, I think there's good in every person. Every person has some good in them. And I talk about in my book how I had this roommate. Oh my God, she was so awful. She was my first roommate. And after a few months with this lady, I said, my mother said there's some good in everybody. But after living with Beverly, I don't think I question that. I'm just not so sure. I always look to the bright side because I don't get any joy out of being unhappy or making anyone else unhappy. I will You can do something awful to me and I will feel very badly about it, and I will probably let you have a piece of my sharp tongue, but I'm still going to come back and be the kind, compassionate person that I know that I am, that I was taught to be by my mother. But I also love the fact that I have the spine of my father and I can stand up for myself under any circumstances. So
Yeah.
the way I reconcile these two is because I had these two diabolically different parents. They were so different that they made me into this person that has the best of both of them. I said in my book also, they gave me her name and his face. So
Mm.
here I am.
It's a gift. Is a gift. And I had a guest on the show, Renee Brown, who talked a lot about not letting anybody take your shine. And I
Yeah,
think there's a lot of lessons in what you were just sharing, is that so often across the spectrum of our relationships with different people, whether it's family, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's our own family, is like, how do we make sure that we have clarity over who we are, the value we bring, and our worth? And it feels like the gift that your mother gave to you was, again, that's your father, right? That's your relationship with your father, but that does not indicate, diminish, or change in any way your value and your
right.
shine.
Absolutely. In fact, I'll share with you when I was 4 years old, and this isn't the most positive view of my father. I was sitting on a chair. I was dressed for Sunday school. And as I said, I've got all these brothers and sisters. I've got an older brother and an older sister, and there are these younger babies, and nobody's paying me any attention, but I have dressed myself for Sunday school. I'm sitting on a chair, and dad walks through the kitchen, and I look up, hoping probably for maybe a smile or something. And he said, "I didn't know you were so stupid." And I thought, I've never heard that word before. I've no idea what it means. But when I look at his face, it didn't look like it was a very nice thing. At that moment, and people look at me and say, "How could you possibly think that at that age?" But at that moment, I decided I don't know what stupid is, but I'm not gonna be stupid, whatever that is. When one of my sisters asked me not so many years ago, she said, "You always seem so self assured. How long after you left home did it take you to feel that way?" And that's when I remembered being 4 years old sitting on that chair. But why he said that to me is because I had dressed myself. I'm sitting there with my socks. He said, "Look at your socks." And the heel is sitting on top of my foot.
Mm.
I thought, well, dang, if that makes me stupid, what's she? But
Right.
anyway, so I told my sister after that moment, I probably always had it in me. I'm just, I'm okay. You can't take my shine, to use that lady's words.
Yeah. Precocious 4-year old for sure. And you think about, like, words matter.
Yes,
Right.
they
And for
do.
you, the word mattered, but you didn't understand the definition of that word, but you also saw the energy around it, the intention around the utilization of that particular word. And I think it's one of those things that's so important for us all to recognize is, like, how do you overcome something like that? Like, not knowing exactly what was being conveyed, but understanding that you were not going to live into that word.
Yes, and it's so interesting that you say that not everybody overcomes that.
Yeah,
There are some people who such a thing would crush. But
absolutely.
like I said, that spine of my father's wouldn't allow me to do that. He
Mm.
delivered that message, but he also delivered to me a backbone of steel. And you can't make me feel less than because I am not less than.
Yeah.
So I thank you, Father. I thank you, Daddy, for
Yeah.
giving me that part of you which won't allow me to be diminished by anyone.
Yeah. And what I'm hearing is it's so important for us. I think so often in today's society where everyone's posting to Instagram or even on Facebook, we're looking for that positive reinforcement externally for someone else to say you're good enough. And
Yes.
while that's nice icing on the cake, right? And we're humans and we all seek that. It's so incredibly important for us to be able to find that inside of ourselves as well, so that you aren't succumbing to what others are saying about you or to you all the time, because then you will lose your sense of value, your sense of wealth, your sense of purpose. How do you do that, whether as a 4 year old or through life? Because even as a 4 year old, it was instilled in you, but I'm sure there were a lot of bows and arrows aimed in your direction throughout the course of your career as an IT professional for years in corporate
Yes,
America, as a
yes, there
Black
were.
author. Like, how do you sustain that sense of self and withstand everything that's thrown your way?
In corporate America, I was fortunate to begin a long career with General Motors at I was age 21. And I was surrounded by white men, and those men were so protective. They were actually protective of me. They
Mm,
wanted to see me succeed, and these people were all much older than I was. And I think back today on that family. Not only were there white men, there were mostly white men in my path, but there were white women who were on the other side. They were the clerical type people, and I was this IT kind of person. But these guys, I remember, I'll never forget being working in the data center, and there was a guy who said to me that you're taking a man's job. And I thought, what are you talking about? And he said, you're taking food from a man's family's mouth. I said, I have a family. I was recently divorced when he said that to me. He said, you should go on welfare. I said, why don't you go on welfare?
mm,
Because I said, I want to work for a living and I'm going to work for a living. And because I was recently divorced, he said, you're going to be just like the rest of these women, always making excuses for why you can't come to work.
wow.
But to that man's credit, more than a year later, he came to me and he said, I owe you an apology. He said, you carry your weight. In fact, you carry the weight of many of us. And as I said earlier in this show, you may be smarter than me, but you can't outwork me. And I don't have to show you how hard I'm working. I just do it because that's what I do. I was able to do exceedingly well in corporate America because I do carry my weight and I don't expect anybody else to carry it for me. And I was quite critical as a younger person in corporate America of those who didn't work as hard. And then I was forced to be a manager, which
Mm,
really upset me because I didn't want to manage. I thought some people are just lazy. That was my opinion. And they don't want to work that hard. But I found out as a manager that most people are doing the best they can. And with proper nurturing and proper training, they can do much better. And my guys said to me, and I had a mostly male team when I was a manager, they said, you are hard, but you are fair.
mm,
Said, when we have to show up in here on the weekends and do whatever we have to do, you might not get your hands in the work because that's not your job. But I bring the pizza and I'm sitting there and I'm ready to hear anything they have to complain about and these guys had my back every step of the way. So I never had to worry in corporate America because there are knives and arrows out there and they would come and tell me where they were. So
yeah.
I had the opportunity or I had the grace. They were gracious enough to give me those where they were coming from, and I knew where to look for them, and I could give him that nice, sweet smile and disarm these people.
Yeah. So a few things to unpack there with that story, and thank you so much for sharing that story. The first is you earn the respect of your peers and your colleagues, not because of a title, not because of something that was given to you, but because you worked hard and you outworked everybody else, particularly in a situation where they were thinking otherwise from the beginning, right? So you weren't
Right.
starting at a level playing field. You were starting below the earth, like trying to figure out how to get out of the hole from the beginning. And that social capital matters. One of the first things you started out when you told that story was that there were white men and white women that helped you along the way in that journey, and that they were the ones that were able to point out where the slings and arrows may be coming from and from who they may be coming from.
Yes,
And I think it's really important for us all to recognize and realize that social capital matters, right? As
it
we're trying to
does.
shift these systems where, people of color, folks in marginalized identities, Black women are seen differently, it's also important for us to find allies, right, inside of those ecosystems, who want to assist us along the way in that journey. The second thing that resonated with me, Mildred J, was that individual, the young man, older man who came to you and said that you're taking somebody's job, you're taking food off of the table of that individual's family, did not realize that Abraham had prepared you for this long
Yes,
ago,
he had.
right? Whatever he could say paled in comparison to what you had heard and what you had overcome for decades. And then lastly, I think that this is one of the things that's really important is, again, words matter. So you hear the word stupid, you hear the word lazy. There's so much beyond that. And I think so often people try to label individuals or groups, and there's so much more nuance and complexity to anything. And so how we see somebody as being lazy, there could be circumstances, or stupid, or not as good of, or whatever. Like, it's our responsibility as human beings, if we want that same thing to be given to us, is to give grace to others in those particular moments. And some people just don't know, they weren't gifted the understanding of what discipline is, or hard work is, or great communication skills, or any of those things, teamwork, the things that help you be successful in the workplace. And so if you can be patient and actually demonstrate, right, or encourage or challenge people to close those gaps, it's amazing what can be accomplished.
Absolutely. In fact, thinking back to the person who forced me to be a manager, his name was James Pinkney. It was in Dayton, Ohio. And he said, there was a woman who knew that it was her job. He was going to leave, he was going to be promoted, and he needed to find his backfill. He said, I want you to take that job. I said, but this person wants that job. He said, she's not qualified. You are. She's been here longer, but you can take this job. And I did. I was so upset. I said, I don't want to be a manager. And he forced me to do that. And it was one of the greatest things because it allowed me to be a teacher. It not only allowed me to be a worker, it allowed me to teach and to mentor and to groom others to be in the position that I was in. And I greatly appreciate that.
How do you discern between the things that you don't want to do, but that you choose to say yes to or no to? How do you discern from those things that you may be resistant to, but may be good for you? How do you understand what that is and say yes to those moments?
In that particular case, I decided I'll give it a try. And I said, I'll give it a try for you. And then when I got into it, like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I appreciated the fact that people trusted me. And that's what I hadn't earned that trust. And I didn't know that people would trust me as a manager. And I didn't want to be judged. And I didn't want to be called stupid. I decided to go and earn my stripes by being a manager and by being someone that they could look up to and by just being the best that I could be and try to mentor others. And I found that, like I said, I was actually good at it. And from that point on, I thought, okay, I'll be a manager. I am a manager.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's really important for individuals to recognize, when you choose to say no to something, why are you actually saying no? Are you saying no because it actually is not what you want to do, or it's not safe? Or are you saying no because you're not sure if you're capable? I think so often, particularly like women, right? You think that you have to check 10 of the 9 boxes off before you'll say
Right.
yes to something. And that your story is an example of why it's important for us to reevaluate situations and to know those spaces where we simply don't want to do something, or it's not good for us, or if it's a situation that you're saying no because there's fear on the other side.
And I never thought about that until you just asked that question. Why? The question of why I never thought about. There was fear, and then there was the fear of being judged and the fear of not being good enough. I know that as an individual contributor, I had that, but as someone who was responsible for other people's work, I wasn't so sure about that, and I was really hesitant and reluctant to find out about it.
Yeah. So where else, if at all, did that fear of judgments, has that shown up in your life and along your way on your journey?
Fear and judgment I was a single mother. I was 20 years old when I got pregnant in college and had my daughter. And I was pressured by the lady who then became my mother-in-law. I didn't want to get married. I didn't want to be pregnant. I didn't want to be anybody's wife. I had been I had mothered so many children. Now, my mother was the mother in that house, but she woke me up in the middle of the night to help take care of these babies for years. And I didn't want to take care of any more babies. And I had seen my father as a husband, and I sure didn't want one of those.
Mm.
So I feared I didn't want to be anybody's wife. And my boyfriend's mother kept saying, "You need to get married. You need to get married." And I thought, why do I need to get married? I didn't plan the child. I loved that child, and I thought she was a gift from God. When I finally got over the fact that, yep, you're pregnant, young lady, but I was fearful of failure, and that marriage did fail. But I gave it my all. But I knew in my heart I really didn't feel that I was ready for marriage. I wasn't ready for a family. And there are those who will say, you shouldn't have been doing the things that got you there. And I think that's awfully harsh of people to say these things, because these kinds of things have been happening since Adam and Eve. So I think that we should be more sensitive and more kind to people in situations. And some of us have been in those situations ourselves, but yet we have the nerve to throw stones. But yes, that was one of those instances where I absolutely feared marriage and I feared being a mother. But I tell you what, I stepped up to the mother part. I raised two children to be grown, to be adults, and they're okay.
That's great. Julie Lipcott Haynes would love the fact that you said raising two children to be adults. And I know that she has a great book with a similar title. And one of the
Ah,
things that I hear from your message is this sense of the role fear plays in our life and in our journey. And sometimes I know with my coaching clients, we ask the question all the time, is that the truth or is that a story you're telling yourself? And I think sometimes fear, we allow it to manifest itself in our lives and to be the truth. But how do we actually be able to pause, recognize what we may be afraid of, unpack a little bit and figure out, okay, like how do I overcome this? Fear doesn't have to be the answer. It doesn't have to be the thing that impacts the outcome. It could be the thing that informs you of some gaps you need to fill.
absolutely. In fact, you remind me of another fear that I had. At the end of my career as an IT person, I sued my employer for race discrimination. That was a terrifying time for me. It was very terrifying. And as a result of having gone through that, I found out that I had been in this male dominant field. And of course, this wasn't with General Motors, it was with a different company. But I had been in this male dominant field. I had abandoned the very soft female side of me. And once I was out of that awful place, I'm not talking about a physical place, I mean that mental
Energy.
place. Yes, that energy. I never in my life thought that I would ever see a psychiatrist. In fact, my next podcast is about, I heard a quote recently that says, it's okay not to be okay, but it's not okay to stay that way. And I just found that after I got out of that situation, when I learned the outcome of that lawsuit, which was in Houston, Texas, no, I wasn't going to win it, but I was not going to sit back and allow them to push me around like that. I stood up to fight for my mother. I stood up to fight for other women and people like me who are in these situations. But after that situation was over, I walked out my front door and I was able to smile. And I thought, I took every suit and pair of pants and all those things that I had worn to that corporate place, and I gave them to a homeless shelter and for a woman's shelter.
Right.
And I also went to that place and asked, what can I do to help? I became a volunteer there. I volunteered at a children's hospital. And if I tell you, I wasn't earning a dime doing those things, but I felt so whole. I felt complete. And I felt like I had reclaimed a part of me that I had lost in all those 30 plus years of working in corporate America. And I thought, there are people who need you and people who need to hear your voice. But yet, and I've given to charities. I give generously to all kinds of people and places, but I wasn't giving that time, letting people see my energy and my face and help people understand that just because you're born into a situation doesn't mean you have to stay there. What are you willing to do to change your circumstances?
Yes, I absolutely appreciate Mildred J, about the stories that you've been sharing is exactly the essence of what you shared. Is you've reclaimed that part of you. You've reclaimed
Yes.
who you are and who you're destined to be. And that's what we try to do on Unlocking the Club. And it's struck me throughout our conversation today is that you literally are fundamentally executing the formula that is required for us to reclaim our power. I believe that in order for that to happen, we have to unlock our truth. And you have been so gracious in your honesty and your candor about your story, sharing some things that, right, may not be easy to share, may
Right.
not be those things that you want people to associate with who you are and what your journey is. And I think it's really difficult for all people, all humans to do that. But I also think that for Black women, we don't do enough of that, right? Because we are focused on how do we help everyone else, pull everyone else through. Like we don't want to focus on our pain, but unlocking your story and your truth helps you to understand what is actually going on and where you want to get to. And then sharing your story. Like you, whether it's through your current podcasts, Cotton Patch Moments, or the upcoming podcast that you're talking about, I think it's really important for us to share our truth and our story so that we can not only reclaim our power, but help others reclaim their power as well. How challenging has it been for you to be so open in your story?
Oh, it's been very challenging. In fact, I don't know that I could have been so open if both my parents was still with me. In fact, I started writing this book probably 10 years ago. And after my mother passed in 2008, so that's been a little more than 10 years ago, I saw the pain that my father was in. He suffered and he struggled mightily. And I showed my father the daughter that he raised. I went to check on him. I
Mm.
would prepare some of his favorite meals, all these kind of things. But the story I began writing some years ago showed my father as not a very nice man at all. In fact, I didn't see and didn't display those kind sides that I know that he had and that I benefited from. That's how I've been able to be so open. I can now tell my story, and not everyone will agree with my telling this story because we also, as Black women and sometimes as Black people, say, leave the past in the past.
Yeah.
And that is a private matter, that's a family matter. But I think that sometimes our stories will help others, and we need to just open our mouths sometime. And it is not about disparaging a parent, it's not about disparaging a brother or sister, it's not about disparaging anybody, because I also talk about my foibles, my failures. But sometimes we just have to open up and talk. And one of the things that I also say is, I told my story in this book. I cried, I laughed, and I healed. And I didn't even have to see a psychiatrist.
Yes, yes. And I think that's the essence of it, right? Whatever platform we choose to use to tell our story, it could simply be to journal about it. It could be to share it with a therapist. It could be in private company with some of your best friends who you can trust your innermost secrets with. It could be in a much more open platform, such as you're doing in your podcast and in your books. But the things that I know for sure is there's a catharsis that happens when you're able to just let go of those things that you're holding on to for a variety of really valid reasons. So there is that catharsis, but there's also on Oprah's podcast, she mentioned this, that there's this essence of, I think her guest was Neeb, and I can't remember the last name, but there's this essence of you light a candle for somebody else and let them know that they're not alone. Because
Right.
so often we feel like we're alone on our journey. And so it's really important for them to understand that's not just the case as well.
Yeah, and what's really weird is how you grow up in your home and you think that everything that happens in your house is normal. And
Yeah.
then you leave there and you think, dang, that's not normal at all. And some of it is great, something great happening in your home or something awful happening in your home. But I just will never, I just love the fact that getting outside of your comfort zone opens up a whole new world for you if you allow it to come in, if you allow that light to come in.
That literally is the essence of what this journey is about and the reasons behind discovering who we are and what it is that we want so that you can make that decision of how you start to share your story or leverage your story and the impact that you want to be able to have, whether it's with yourself on your own journey or with your daughters or your children or in your community. And Mildred J. Mills, I appreciate you being willing to share, really unlock your truth.
Thank you so
Back
much.
as a 4-year-old, and then share your story in so many platforms, and certainly unlocking the club, and then be a shining example of what it means to reclaim your power. That is a sense that I'm certainly getting from you. And I want to find out a little bit more about your journey and who you are and how you got to this point, because I know it wasn't easy. You make it seem flawless and easy, but I know that it's not always easy to get to that point. I have a few more questions for you here on the back nine. And so stay with me for a little bit. All of our listeners and subscribers, stay with us. We're going to have a quick break, but then we'll be right back on Unlocking the Club with the back nine with our special guest today, Mildred J. Mills. Welcome back to Unlocking the Club. I'm your host, Angela Taylor. And before we let our special guest, Mildred J. Mills, go today, I want to invite her to join us for this back nine. And it's a place where I like to continue to peel back the curtain a little bit during a speed round of questions that just I'm always curious about when I'm in conversation with guests. So Mildred, I think the first question I have for you is, besides your own home, what is the place where you feel the safest to be yourself?
The place I feel the safest and to be myself is near the ocean.
Mm.
When I stand near the ocean, I'll never forget the first time I saw the ocean. It was during my honeymoon, and I was on a ship, and I looked out beyond that ship, and it looked like the sky met the ocean. And
Mm.
all I could think was, how great thou art. And I recently went to California and I saw the ocean again, and it just draws me there and takes me to a place where I feel like the, my possibilities are endless. I can think and I can write and I can be anybody I want to be in that place.
Yeah, I love that. Like, water is so cathartic. And for some, it might be, I started gardening a couple of years ago, and just to be outside in fresh air, open space, not a lot of competing messages, right? Your TV, your computers, your phone ringing all the time, taking a hike. I think it's really important for us all to make sure we understand where those spaces are that we can find ourselves.
Yes,
And I think nature is one of those things that just rolls through our souls and our beings that allows us to pause for a moment and to be able to reflect and to open our minds. So I love that.
absolutely. That's the way I feel when I am near the ocean. There
Mm.
is nothing between me and that cloud that appears when that sky that appears to be meeting the ocean. And I just think, like I said, that I can see the world in a forever place. I just love that.
Yeah, yeah. We talked a little bit about fear of judgments or other things that may have us stop or to say no. Was there a situation where you would walk into with trepidation in your past, in your journey, or currently? And if so, like, how have you found ways to navigate that hesitancy that may show up, that resistance or friction that may be showing up in those moments?
The way was able to navigate that discrimination that I perceived was going on years ago in the workplace, I walked in confident and sometimes I actually allowed my anger to take over. So I would go in with this attitude of, I know dang I'm not that person that you think I am, and I'm going to force you to see that. So I have, as I've aged, learned to just be myself, and I walk in with that confidence and I mean it. And I don't care what you think about me. I don't care what you say about me. I am not those things. I know exactly who I am, and it is not that stupid, whatever person that you believe I am. So I've found out how to ignore all the noise and just be me.
Mm. So knowing your truth, right?
Yes.
Knowing who you are and maybe being surrounded. One of my good friends, Trisha Stevens Lamb, has coined this, and I absolutely love it. Your team of allies, those people who will tell you the truth, but that also will tell you who you are. And that
Yes.
reflection of who you are is really important for you in those moments where there can be fear of judgment.
Absolutely. In fact, I know there are two people that I can pick the phone up and say anything to
Mm.
at any time. And they will always, first of all, they're going to always back me, but they're always going to tell me the truth. Always. And I just appreciate that so much. And these are friends that I've had for more than 50 years.
Mm. Well, Mildred, I found you incredibly revealing and honest throughout this conversation and in the work that you're doing. What is it that you refuse to hide about yourself and why?
I refuse to hide the fact that I have been hurt and I've had pain just like anybody else. And I refuse to hide that because I think it's important for us to reveal those most vulnerable spots so that those things disarm people a little bit. And I think that just to reveal those things helps me to be a stronger person and helps me to deal with whatever you've got. I can deal with it. I can handle it.
Yeah, you can handle it. You
Yes.
absolutely can handle it. And but you also have to acknowledge it, whatever it is. And I think so often we high achievers, folks that are action oriented, we got to get to the next thing, right? So we
Yep.
step over whatever it is that actually is going to stay with you. It's not going to go away because you're ignoring it. And so important for you to be able to name and notice what's happening for you, and then to be able to take control over it and don't let it take control over you and your journey. So I appreciate that. And I sense this. I have a couple different ideas of where you can go with this, but what's your superpower?
My superpower is, hey, just knowing who I am. My
Yeah.
superpower is also recognizing those people that are going to be honest with me. And my superpower is just my confidence in myself and just knowing that there is not one thing that I am going to attempt that I'm not going to accomplish. For instance, with my book, it's my first book. And think about this, I am not a spring chicken. I am 72 years old. And I tried the traditional route. I talked to a number of traditional publishers, and I had even spoke with a couple of agents, and I had the most beautiful notes that said, "Oh my God, what a story! This is a heavy duty memoir." And this one lady said, even with all those amazing hooks, she said, I don't know that I can sell it because every movie star now has decided that they want to tell their story. And they have these 20,000, 40,000, a million followers. And I don't know if those turn into book sales or not. But I thought to myself, that's when I decided that my motto is never underestimate the power of rejection. I have many ways that I can publish my book, and I'm going to do this. And I will work my butt off to make sure that many people hear what I have to say. So there's my superpower, just refusing to take no for an answer.
Yes, yes, that's been embedded in you since you can even remember. And I think it's one of those things that's important is we need to hear more stories of Black women overcoming, right? That resilience that shows up, the anti-fragility that shows up, your story, your truth, your honesty. And I think it's really important. I'm glad that you didn't let, right, that response or feedback dictate what you are going to choose to do or the importance of being able to put the story out there. Because frankly, if one person reads that story and it impacts them, right, that's
Yes.
all that we can ask, right? And there's going to be a multiplier as a result of that.
I absolutely agree. And I can tell you that I have a number of people that keep saying, when's the book coming out? When's the book coming out? And I thought, Lord, I better get this book out
Get it
because
right.
I want them to hear this story. And there are a number of book clubs that want me to read for them. And I am so excited to do that. And I've read for a couple, and there's humor. When people think memoir, in fact, a guy from Simon and Schuster said something about these misery memoirs. And I said, a misery memoir? What the
Mm,
heck is that? There's some mighty powerful stories and there's humor, and there are these amazing highs, but there are some devastating lows. But guess what? Every one of those lows turned into a high. I'm not going to be stopped by a low. You just got to keep climbing regardless of how hard the journey seems.
Yes. Tell us a little bit more about this project. So when is the book released? Where can we find it when it's going to be released? What's the title? And what did you learn about yourself through writing the book?
I learned through writing this book that I can bear my worst wounds
Mm,
and I can do it with grace. In fact, in the words of a publisher that read this book, he said, how you can tell that story that has so much pain and so much joy, and how you can do it with such love and respect. I still don't know how you can do that. But I love and respect those people that were in my life, namely my parents and my siblings and myself. So, what I learned about myself is that, hey, you can do any tough job. This was a tough job. This was tougher than any job in corporate America or any place else. And what was the rest of that question? Tell me
So
again.
where can we find, when's it being released and where can we find it?
Yes, the book is being released in December, and we actually have a date, but it's mid-December. I won't give you the exact date in case that, in fact, it's a very special date in December. And you can find that the book can be found. It will be an ebook as well as on bookshelves, and I will actually update people on social media as that date rolls around. And the name of that book is Daddy's House, and it's a daughter's memoir of setbacks, triumphs, and rising above her roots.
Mm, that's fantastic. That is fantastic. Where can we find you so that we can follow the progress, find out when it's going to be officially launched, and where we can make sure that we get a pre-release or pre-order?
Yeah, my website is mildredjmills.com. And I am Mildred J. Mills I use Facebook a lot and I use Instagram, and I need to use them more, but wow, this team of one kind of gets bogged down in the stuff and doesn't post nearly enough. But I am Mildred J. Mills on Facebook and Instagram, and I'm actually on LinkedIn and other places. And I need to do a better job. In fact, I talked to my niece today and said, I might need some help. These young folks, she's in her early 20s, and she said, I can help you do that. And I'm thinking it might be time for me to seek that help.
Yes, yes. And that's another episode of talking about help, right? Our hesitation to ask for help. It helps us close the gap so much quicker, but also
Yes.
there's that imposter syndrome, right? Of saying, am I capable? Do I have the capacity? You're so independent. You like to be able to do things on your own, and it's okay to be able to ask for help. But Mildred, we cannot wait to be able to grab a copy of Daddy's House. Thank you for revealing your story with such grace here on Unlocking the Club, but certainly through the book. And I have no doubt that there's going to be a profound impact that you will have on inside of so many different identities as a result of being able to read your story. And I am eternally grateful for you choosing Unlocking the Club to be able to share a little bit of your story as well. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, you are so welcome. And I am so grateful that you would have me as a guest on Unlocking the Club, because I know just talking to you, you're unlocking an awful lot of things, not just the club. I really appreciate your work, and I am grateful to be a guest on your show.
Mm, thank you so much.
Thank you as well.
All right. That was our special guest today, Mildred J. Mills. Again, thank you for joining us on this episode of Unlocking the Club. And to all of you who are watching on YouTube or listening on your preferred podcast platform, thanks for joining us today. There are so many nuggets that I heard and learned in the conversation with Mildred, that there's the language that matters. There's the fact that fear can stop you in many different ways, and how you choose to show up in those moments really matters. So I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Mildred J. Mills today on Unlocking the Club. And I encourage you, if you want to continue the conversation, go ahead and join us over on our Facebook page, the Code Breakers Lounge, as we continue to dissect the conversation, as we seek to unlock our truth, share our stories, and reclaim our power. For Angela Taylor, your host of Unlocking the Club, our Unlocking the Club team, and on behalf of Mildred J. Mills, thank you so much for joining us for today's episode of Unlocking the Club. Until next time, be well.
Thanks for listening to Unlocking the Club. If this conversation resonated with you, subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or your favorite streaming platform so that you can experience every episode. And follow us on social media, where you'll hear about future guests, access special features, and connect with this amazing community. Head on over there and let us know how you are unlocking the club. Until next time, peace.